So my topic is a bit of an outlier in this sequence because I talk not about Armenian-Azerbaijan relationship, but about the Turkish-Armenian one, although I have similar data somewhat about Armenia-Azerbaijan as well, so hopefully at some point I can cover that as well. And in my case, the political developments are the background or not the foreground of the conversation. And the main topic I'm covering is the changes, the transformation in a discourse in Turkish-Armenian dialogue initiatives between 2005 and 2017. And this is the organization, the Imagine Center, under the name of which most of the work that I'm discussing has been happening. I'm breaking this period into three quite distinct political periods. The first one is 2005-2006. This is prior to the murder of Hrant Dink and prior to this intensive normalization process. The second period is 2007-2012. That's very active attempts at normalization and a lot of civil society efforts. And the third period is the recent one where we have a big decline again in attempts to normalize Turkish-Armenian relations. And immediately jumping to the very first one, this is a period, of course, that started much earlier than 2005-2006. This is many decades of isolation of Turks and Armenians, specifically in the countries of Turkey and Armenia. It's a legacy of the Cold War. Of course, following the Cold War, we have Turkey closing the border with Armenia, following the start of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In the same period in Turkey, we had again many decades of wiping out Armenians from the collective memory, from historiography, from history textbooks. In a very rare instances when Armenians were mentioned, they are mentioned in a very negative light. In Armenian and Turkey and Turks are present much more, of course, but also exclusively in a negative light. And the word Turk is often used as an equivalent of the word enemy. Yeah, the textbooks are quite heavy on discussing the occupation and massacres and so on that were happening under the Turkish rule to the Armenians. And in this period, there were very few attempts at resolving or improving Turkish-Armenian relations. As we know now, there were some back-channel talks already happening in early 2000s, but there was nothing really publicly visible, other than maybe one or two initiatives that were taken very negatively on both ends. The most prominent ones were the Turkish-Armenian Reconciliation Commission that took place in early 2000s, and that had a very big backlash, a nationalist backlash, particularly in Armenia. There was also an attempt in 2005 to hold a conference on Ottoman Armenians in Turkey. Eventually it took place after a few failed attempts, and that also was faced with this very strong backlash. And interestingly, it was Erdogan who at some point came to the support of the conference. It was the time when there was very active attempts to integrate with Europe, of course. And why I chose 2005-2006 and not an earlier period is simply because that's when I got involved in Turkey-Armenia conversation and organized the very first dialogue that I facilitated. It took place in Boston. I was a graduate student at the Brandeis University there, and I kept seeing these constant disagreements and arguments between Turkish and Armenian students happening, both at Brandeis, my university, but also all across Boston, mostly on the topic of whether or not there was a genocide. And I was already facilitating some other dialogue processes, such as Arab-Israeli one, and I thought to use my experience and approach some Turkish students, some Armenian students, and we put together this dialogue group that involved students from all the Boston area universities, only graduate students. It was about 25 people. And we were meeting from September 2005 until the end of the academic year in late April 2006, once a week, about 3 hours. So it was like a class almost, meeting every week for a duration of 9 months. A very intensive dialogue. And we started trying to resolve our relationships without knowing really what we are doing, so without necessarily any methodology. So it was a lot of trial and error that went into this dialogue. And there was some interesting development that soon after starting, we became friends on a personal level because we would meet once a week and then would go out for drinks and so on. And so somehow we got to become very close. Well, once we would get back into the dialogue room, it would go back to fighting about genocide and everything else you can imagine. And gradually something started moving. And there was a moment in late April 2006 when we felt that the dialogue was over for us. There was nothing to talk about. And it came on April 24. Prior to that, on April 23, I received a phone call from one of the Turkish participants who asked if the Armenian group is going somewhere to commemorate the genocide. And we figured there was a commemoration happening in some church, and they said they want to join. So Turks and Armenians together, we go to this commemoration. And I remember going, walking there, I was talking to one of the Armenians how hard that should be to my Turkish friends, because I read these articles about Jews and Germans together going to concentration camp memorials and Germans feeling extremely guilty and so on. So we were really worried about the emotional state of our Turkish friends. But what happened there wasn't really problematic for them. It was much more problematic for the Armenian group. The commemoration wasn't commemoration in my understanding coming from Yerevan prior to that, because there we would just go and lay a flower to a memorial or something to this extent. This commemoration was a political speech by a pretty well-known American-Armenian person. And it was little talk about commemoration as such, in my understanding, or even about the genocide. It was a lot of talk about how bad people Turks are. And it culminated in about 30 minutes into the talk in a passage that I probably don't remember verbatim, but I reproduce as much as I can. So he was telling something like this, that after many years of being invited to this horrible country, meaning Turkey, I finally go there, and I'm on my way from airport to the hotel, and I see two kinds of houses or buildings. Some have small windows, others have big windows. And it's immediately clear to me that the ones with big windows used to belong to Armenians and other Christians because they are full of light and open to the world as the Armenian souls are. And the ones with small windows always belong to the Turks because they are dark and closed as the Turkish souls are. And the whole Armenian group got up and left the commemoration at this point. We went home and came back the next day and really sat together and said there is nothing really to talk about. The dialogue is over because the Turkish group did its part, came to the commemoration, implicitly or explicitly acknowledged the genocide and understood the importance of it for the Armenians. And the Armenians realized if this is how we are presenting this story, if we are coming to the Turks telling you have small dark souls, it's probably very hard to hear an argument after that. But we went on giving public lectures together and so on, but we tried to develop a methodology to have other groups to go through dialogue as well. And we realized they cannot go through one-year-long dialogue, obviously, the way we had the luxury to do, being students at the time. And we went back kind of reconstructing and analyzing our process through the year and trying to see what worked for us, what didn't work. And what we understood worked was, first of all, the personal relationship, of course, that made it easier to communicate. But second of all, there was this very analytic component to what happened. We did, at some point, came to these two timelines. So on the left, we have the Turkish timeline, let's say on the right, the Armenian historical timeline. And there was this very analytic discussion of, just visually to show it, I'll go to the content in a second. Visually, so you can have two timelines and you could really analyze and discuss them one next to another. And here is the contents from that very first, the 2005-2006 dialogue group of Boston. On the left here you have the Armenian timeline, on the right the Turkish one. And if you read, you can see it's a probably small font. The Armenian one is a classic victim story. It starts as an ancient nation that adopted Christianity in 301. It goes through a long period of being colonized by different empires that culminates in the colonization by the Ottoman Empire. There is a lot of persecution of Armenians. There is a lot of massacres, of course, Abdul Hamid massacres, the Armenian genocide. And then you have the denial of the Armenian genocide by Turkey. You have one relatively self-critical element. It's Asala terrorism, which is phrased actually as Asala without necessarily terrorism following it, so kind of very mild self-criticism. The Turkish story is very, very different. It's a story of a glory. It starts with the conquest of Constantinople in 1071. It's followed by the foundation of the Ottoman Empire, which is presented as a benevolent, really great empire. There's a very strong emphasis on minority rights, which were adopted in Ottoman Empire long before. They were known even to Europe. There is also strong emphasis on minority rights in the present-day Turkish Republic, particularly in the context of EU accession. And there are two, again, critical, somewhat self-critical points. One is about the pogroms against the minorities in 1955. And the second one is 1915, Armenian deportations. But of course, we understand this phrasing, Armenian deportations itself, was not appreciated, let's say, by the Armenians in the group, who would prefer to hear it called genocide. As we started analyzing these timelines later on as the dialogue was over, a few things became very apparent to us. Yeah, first of all was that the participants knew nothing about each other's stories. So we were discussing about what's the history of Turkish-Armenian relations. The question was the same. But what we came up with was extremely different on one end and on the other end. Again, interestingly, there was very little to no contradiction between the two. Every single event listed there has some factual basis to it. It's just the way you phrase it, or which events you choose from history is very selective. And you, of course, as we know from collective memory studies and discourse analysis as well, we pick the events that are convenient for us, or that are fitting the present-day politics and present-day narratives. So Armenians, of course, focused on their victim story and everything negative about Turks, and Turks focused on kind of all the glorious story of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey. But these all events are actually quite compatible. Even the genocide, which might seem quite contradictory, yes, there were deportations, of course, and yes, there was genocide. Yeah, there is no contradiction between the two. The deportations don't contradict the presence of a genocide that followed. But another few learnings, we saw that each side kind of through its story builds a stereotype about itself, either as a victim or as a positive group, and the negative stereotypes about the other group. So based on this, we went on developing and conducting many, many more dialogues since then and up until today, and the next one is happening actually in 2 weeks. We are timing it together with the commemoration of the Armenian genocide on April 24. But that was this last development with this Turkish-Armenian dialogue group of Boston in 2006 that brings into the conversation Hrant Dink. So Hrant Dink gave us a call in late 2006 asking for an interview, because now there are great many Turkish-Armenian dialogues happening, and since then there were, probably thousands of them. At this time, though, they weren't all that many. There were just a few. So he heard about us, gave us a call. And interesting how really things change quickly. At this point, Hrant Dink was so controversial, both in Armenia and in Turkey, that the group actually didn't risk to give him an interview. Because in Armenia, he was seen as being too much pro-Turkish and talking about against the law in France, against the denial of the Armenian genocide. At that point, it was discussed. In Turkey, it was controversial for talking about the genocide. So both the Armenian and Turkish participants refused to give him an interview. And a few months after, of course, he was killed in January 2007 and became a big hero. And up to today, a lot of people in this group regret refusing this interview. But his murder completely changed the political landscape, literally in one day. Yeah? So we had these big demonstrations in the streets with the banners, we are all Armenians, we are all Hrant, in Istanbul. The conversation about genocide that was effectively outlawed up to that point in Turkey suddenly became possible. A great many, not only academics, but also journalists started writing about the genocide. Let me jump to the next slide. There was great many conferences held. I remember first time being in Turkey in 2010. I was worrying, should I use the word genocide or not? And I realized the conversation was way past that. There was a much more advanced conversation about how to recognize it. There were commemorations happening every year, starting in Istanbul, then spreading to Ankara, then to Izmir, and to a great many other cities, very public. Then in 2009, there was an apology campaign when 30,000 Turks signed an apology, although without use the word genocide, but still an apology to the Armenians. And of course, at the same time, we have a very active normalization process starting that comes out of the shadows and becomes public. You have in Turkey the Gül-Davutoglu tandem, still very active and has strong power. It's the president and the prime minister, yes, who developed the zero problems with neighbors policy that includes normalization with Armenia. We have Sarkisyan coming to power in 2008, and the first move he makes in foreign policy is, of course, to try to normalize relations with Turkey. And in parallel to the official track, you have this proliferation of unofficial efforts. If before that you can count them just, in maybe, two hands, fingers of two hands. At that point, it becomes hundreds, if not thousands, of efforts. So you have this really big push towards normalization, and we continue conducting dialogues in this process. And I won't discuss all of them, but I'll just give as detailed as I did with the first one, but I'll give you the summary of how the historical discourse changed. There is a picture from one of these dialogues. It was called Capturing the Mountain, because the idea was to climb or hike the mountain Ararat and conduct a dialogue during the hike and film it and make a documentary out of it. We never raised enough funding to actually hike Ararat, unfortunately, so we did a smaller hike in Georgia. But the dialogue happened, and the short documentary was made as well. What was important, though, the discourse changed dramatically between this 2005 and 2006, when we knew almost nothing about each other, and it was so divergent. By 2010, 11, 12, the discourses became almost identical. The Armenian one became much softer on its own victimhood. There was great many events mentioned that weren't necessarily presenting Armenians as victims. And there was also much more mention of good periods of coexistence, either with Azerbaijanis or with Turks, which didn't exist in this very early dialogue we had. On the Turkish end, the shift was even more dramatic. It was actually quite similar suddenly to the Armenian timeline. Yeah, there was well awareness of the Abdul Hamid massacres, dialogue after dialogue. There was much more awareness about the genocide. Many people started calling it genocide. Others would maybe still call it a massacre or a deportation, but with an understanding of the magnitude of what happened. Almost outright denial stopped happening at that point. So really, as you could see, there was a big shift in the timelines that started looking increasingly similar. And then we have of course, the failure of the protocols process, and that was followed also with a sense that the governments aren't all that supportive of the informal efforts as well, particularly in Armenia, I would say, stronger than in Turkey in this sense. By 2015, especially, you have, of course, Armenians commemorating the centenary of genocide. At this point, you had a lot of obstruction from the government, again, in nothing violent, but still clearly sending signals that they are not supporting even in official dialogues. The Gül-Davutoglu group start losing power within AKP, so Turkish policy also becomes much less friendly. There is much stronger support to Azerbaijan. We also have in parallel escalation on the Karabakh, in Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone, and that kind of draws Turkey to express stronger support to Azerbaijan. And today, as yesterday was also mentioned, there are, as far as I know, almost also no official level contacts happening. There are some small attempts to revitalize this process, but it's almost non-existent, and again, very low level of track to work as well. And now against this, as we saw, when there was a positive shift in official relationships, there was also a big kind of positive shift in terms of the discourses that became closer. And looking into the more present-day dialogues, last year, 2016, 2017, this year already, and trying to see if there was a negative shift paralleled in the dialogues, and there wasn't. In fact, the timelines, and again, the dialogues aren't focused only on history, but I only looked for this research into the history, the conversation about history, and see what is the discourse there. And the timelines remained extremely similar. Moreover, I think they got even closer. So if 2010, 11, 12, these really active normalization years, the Turkish groups, for example, would mention genocide hesitantly. Very few people would openly call it so. At this point, it's almost not a question. I haven't met any Turkish participants who wouldn't call it a genocide, even if they might have some reservations, but almost 90% of the participants are well aware of it, have acknowledged it, have been to commemorations, and so on. Moreover, there is a very strong request coming now, which didn't happen before, from the Turkish participants to come to Yerevan, to visit the Genocide Museum and Memorial, and so on, to kind of learn more about that. There is a lot of self-criticism and criticism of the government, both on the Armenian and on the Turkish end, in terms of their politics towards each other and towards this relationship, in relation to the textbooks and in relation to how history continues to be presented in a very nationalist and negative light towards each other. So really, this negative shift on official policy wasn't paralleled with a similar shift when it comes to the discourses of participants discussing history. And a couple of highlights from the later dialogues. There is a very strong request from participants coming from both Armenia and Turkey lately to participate in these symbolic events. So one picture is on the left. It's Hrant Dink's murder day commemoration on January 19, 2015. So it's a joint Turkish-Armenian group there. And there will be the next dialogue group we are organizing is this year, which they are again timing to coincide this time with the Armenian genocide commemoration in Istanbul, which will be followed with a dialogue in Yerevan. And the last slide I have is the learning from this. I think it gives some cautious reason for optimism, because we saw it took decades of propaganda, of isolation, to really isolate these two groups and make their discourses completely divergent. It was very quick, so once there was some opening and where dialogue started, the discourses immediately became very similar. There was great awareness about each other. And the change, a negative change on a political end wasn't paralleled with a similar shift in terms of the discourses of participants. Yeah, so it continued kind of merging and really seeing great interest in each other. And probably the just clarification point here that this groups is not the same group I'm talking about, of course, here. Yeah, so these were all different groups. So 2005 was one group, and then each next one was completely new people coming. So it's a very similar demographics. It's usually young people, 20 to 30, who are somehow interested in the improvement of Turkish-Armenian relations, but it's very all different people meeting in different years. That's it. Thank you.